The morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek Estates, a suburban paradise that looked like it had been cut from the pages of a real estate magazine. Every house stood in perfect alignment, a testament to meticulousness that bordered on obsession. But perfection, as David Chen was about to learn, came with a price far steeper than any mortgage. David's home was a modern marvel, a sleek, contemporary structure that pushed the boundaries of traditional suburban design. Unlike the cookie-cutter beige boxes that surrounded it, his house featured clean lines, large windows, and a subtle gray exterior that seemed to change color with the light. It was a reflection of David himself, intelligent, slightly unconventional, but always respectful of his surroundings. At 42, David had spent years building his career as a senior software architect. Silicon Valley had been good to him, but he'd always dreamed of something more than the cramped tech world apartments. Willow Creek Estates represented that dream, a place where he could put down roots, express himself, and be part of a community. The neighborhood had seemed perfect when he first moved in 2 years ago, a carefully curated mix of professionals, mostly in tech, medical, and academic fields. Young families, successful singles, early retirees, all drawn by the promise of a meticulously maintained community. The glossy brochure had promised more than just a home. It promised a lifestyle. "Welcome to Willow Creek Estates," the welcome packet had read, "where community meets excellence." Little did David know that excellence was a word with very specific and incredibly narrow definitions. Judith Hargrove embodied that definition. At 65, she was the undisputed queen of Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. A former real estate agent with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a wardrobe that screamed country club chic, Judith saw the HOA as her personal domain. Her 3-ring binder was legendary among residents, a massive, color-coded tome that documented every single potential violation with the precision of a military operation. To Judith, the HOA was more than just a neighborhood management organization. It was a mission, a calling. She viewed herself as the last line of defense against suburban decay, a guardian of property values and community standards. Every meeting was a performance, every violation notice a declaration of war against anything that threatened her vision of perfection. The HOA meetings were a spectacle of suburban bureaucracy, held monthly in the community clubhouse, a building that looked more like a small conference center than a neighborhood gathering space. These events were part legal proceeding, part social drama. Judith would preside, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, dissecting every potential violation with surgical precision. "A quarter-inch deviation is unacceptable," she would often declare, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Most residents complied. They understood the unspoken rule. It was easier to conform than to fight. Homes were repainted to exact color specifications. Lawns were maintained with mathematical precision. Trash cans were hidden with almost military-level strategy. The community looked pristine, but it came at a cost of individual expression. David had initially found the whole system amusing. Coming from the tech world, where creativity and individuality were celebrated, the HOA's rigidity seemed almost comical. He'd spoken to neighbors, laughed about the absurd rules, thinking they were more of a joke than a serious threat. But jokes in Willow Creek Estates had a way of becoming very serious very quickly. The first warning came subtly, so subtly that David almost missed it. A neatly typed letter, printed on heavyweight paper with the HOA letterhead, tucked precisely in his mailbox. Violation notice #WC 2023-147. David pulled out the document, expecting some routine communication. Instead, he found a meticulously detailed description of his landscaping infractions. The decorative rocks bordering his front yard were approximately 2.5 inches outside the approved landscaping boundary, as defined in Section 4, Paragraph 3 of the HOA bylaws. He laughed. Surely this was a joke. It wasn't. The war had begun, though David didn't know it yet. In the perfectly manicured streets of Willow Creek Estates, the first shots of a suburban rebellion were about to be fired. David Chen stared at the violation notice, a mixture of disbelief and amusement crossing his face. 2.5 inches. That was the extent of his supposed landscaping crime. He considered calling the HOA, thinking surely this was some administrative error, a joke perhaps perpetrated by a board intern. But Judith Hargrove did not do jokes. The next week brought a certified letter, thick, official-looking, with the Willow Creek Estates HOA logo embossed in the top left corner. David's fingers traced the crisp edges before opening it, a sense of foreboding growing with each passing second. $250. The fine was for persistent landscaping boundary violations and non-compliance with community aesthetic standards. Attached was a detailed report, complete with measurements, photographs, and a stern warning about future consequences. David decided to handle this directly. He scheduled a meeting with the HOA board, specifically requesting a sit-down with Judith Hargrove. The community clubhouse looked more like a corporate conference room than a neighborhood meeting space. Gleaming white walls, industrial-grade carpet, and a long mahogany table that seemed more suited to Fortune 500 negotiations than suburban dispute resolution. Judith sat at the head of the table, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, a pale blue blazer pressed within an inch of its life. "Mr. Chen," she began, her voice a carefully modulated blend of condescension and professional courtesy, "the rules are quite clear." David pulled out the photographs and measurements. 2.5 inches, he said calmly. That's the entire basis of this fine. 2.5 inches that don't impact any sight lines, don't interfere with any community standards, and frankly, aren't even noticeable unless you're measuring with a laser level. Judith's smile didn't reach her eyes. Precision is the foundation of community standards, Mr. Chen. Those 2.5 inches represent a slippery slope. Today it's landscape rocks. Tomorrow it could be an unauthorized garden gnome or, heaven forbid, a lawn sculpture. The absurdity of the argument wasn't lost on David, but Judith was deadly serious. She slid a thick document across the table, the Willow Creek Estates Community Covenant. It was a massive tome, at least 2 inches thick, with tabs, subsections, and what appeared to be multiple addendums. Section 4.2. Paragraph C clearly states that all landscaping must conform to the original developer's design specifications. Judith continued, "These rocks are not just a minor infraction. They represent a challenge to our community's carefully maintained aesthetic." David realized he was dealing with more than just a bureaucrat. Judith Hargrove was a true believer. To her, these rules weren't administrative guidelines. They were a sacred text. "I'll move the rocks," David said, hoping to de-escalate the situation. "They'll be within the exact boundary specified." Judith's smile was razor-thin. "The fine will remain in effect. Compliance is not just about the action, Mr. Chen. It's about the attitude." Those words hung in the air, pregnant with implication. David understood then that this was about more than landscaping. This was about control. As he left the clubhouse, David noticed the other board members watching silently. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed almost apologetic. But no one, not a single person, was willing to challenge Judith's authority. The fine would be due in 30 days. Outside, the Willow Creek Estates neighborhood looked impossibly perfect. Lawns were cut with military precision. Not a single leaf was out of place. Trash cans were hidden behind expensive privacy screens. Every house looked identical. A testament to conformity. David Chen realized he had two choices, comply or fight, and he was not the type to comply easily. The fines came like clockwork. Each month, a new envelope from the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association would arrive, more ridiculous than the last. David Chen's kitchen counter became a monument to HOA absurdity. Violation notices spread out like a twisted art installation. $150 for unauthorized exterior light fixture placement. $275 for non-compliant garbage can positioning. $350 for deviation from approved paint tone spectrum. The most recent notice took the cake. A $425 fine for his native plant garden, which Judith Hargrove claimed disrupted the uniform landscape aesthetic of the neighborhood. Maria Rodriguez, his neighbor, was experiencing her own HOA nightmare. A retired civil rights attorney, she had become David's unexpected ally in this suburban war. They're not just issuing fines, Maria explained during one of their strategy sessions. They're conducting economic warfare against homeowners who don't fit their narrow definition of community. Her own violations were equally ridiculous. A $300 fine for her solar panels, which apparently didn't meet the visual harmony standards. Another $250 for her drought-resistant landscaping that deviated from the mandatory grass and shrub combination. The HOA's tactics were becoming increasingly aggressive. Violation notices were now accompanied by professional photographs documenting each infraction in excruciating detail. Drone footage captured every inch of homeowners' properties, searching for the slightest deviation. David began to document everything. His software engineering background proved invaluable. He created a detailed database of every interaction, every fine, every communication with the HOA. Patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. Most concerning was the selective enforcement. Certain homeowners, those who fit a very specific demographic, seemed to receive far fewer violations. The Kims, a Korean-American family, had received multiple notices. The Thompsons, an older white couple who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, seemed to get a pass for similar infractions. It's not about the rules, Maria would say, her legal mind dissecting each notice. It's about who they want in this neighborhood. The financial burden was becoming significant. David calculated that he had paid over $1,500 in fines in just 3 months. Many of his neighbors were facing similar challenges. Some were being forced to choose between fighting the HOA and maintaining their financial stability. At a neighborhood meeting, tensions finally boiled over. David stood up, holding a thick folder of documentation. These fines are not about maintaining community standards, he declared, his voice carrying through the community center. They're about control. A few neighbors nodded. Others looked nervous, unwilling to challenge the status quo. Judith Hargrove sat at the front of the room, her expression a mixture of disdain and barely concealed anger. "Mr. Chen," she interrupted, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "the rules are clear. Compliance is not optional." But David was done being silent. The most recent notice had crossed a line. The HOA was now threatening a lane on his property for unpaid fines. What had started as a minor dispute about landscaping rocks was becoming an existential threat to his home ownership. Maria leaned over, her voice low and determined. "We need a plan," she whispered, "and we need to fight back." The suburban rebellion was about to begin in earnest. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier with an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. David's hands trembled as he unfolded the document. The Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association was initiating foreclosure proceedings against his property. The accumulated fines had ballooned to an astronomical $5,000, a sum that seemed both impossible and terrifyingly real. The breakdown was meticulously detailed. Landscaping violation, $500. Exterior paint color deviation, $750. Unauthorized exterior modification, $1,200. Repeated non-compliance penalties, $2,550. Each line was a knife twist, a calculated attempt to break his spirit and force him out of the community. Maria Rodriguez, his neighbor, found him sitting on the front steps, the foreclosure notice spread out like a battle map. Her own experiences with the HOA had been similarly nightmarish, but this was a new level of aggression. "They can't actually do this," Maria said, her voice a mix of disbelief and anger. She was a retired civil rights attorney, and if anyone understood the nuances of property law, it was her. David's mind raced back to how quickly things had escalated. What had started as a minor dispute about landscaping rocks had transformed into an existential threat to his home, his savings, his entire life's work. The HOA's tactics were calculated. They weren't just issuing fines. They were systematically targeting homeowners who didn't fit their narrow definition of community standard. David had spoken with other residents, collecting their stories in hushed conversations and late-night phone calls. There was Mr. Thompson, an abstract painter whose vibrant front door had resulted in multiple violations. The Kim family, whose traditional Korean garden had been deemed non-compliant, with landscaping guidelines. A young tech entrepreneur whose modern solar installations were considered a visual disruption. A pattern emerged. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were conducting a slow, methodical process of neighborhood homogenization. They want to push out anyone who doesn't conform, Maria explained, spreading out her own collection of HOA correspondence. It's economic cleansing, dressed up as community standards. The foreclosure notice included a clause that felt almost personal. Not only were they seeking to take his home, but they were also demanding immediate removal of all non-standard exterior modifications. The list was exhaustive, from the modern light fixtures to the native plant garden he'd carefully cultivated. David's tech background kicked in. He began documenting everything. Screenshots, photographs, correspondence. Each interaction with the HOA was meticulously recorded, time-stamped, categorized. But documentation wasn't enough. The financial threat was real and immediate. "They're betting you'll break," Maria said, reviewing the documents. They'd done this before. Most people can't afford to fight a legal battle against an HOA. The legal fees alone would bankrupt most homeowners. David thought about his parents, immigrants who had worked every day of their lives to give him opportunities. About the home he had saved for, the dream he had built. About the community he had hoped to be part of. Something inside him shifted. This was no longer about landscaping rocks or paint colors. This was about fundamental rights, about the ability to exist in a space without being constantly policed, constantly threatened. "I'm not going anywhere," David said, his voice quiet but resolute. Maria looked at him, a spark of something, hope, perhaps, flickering in her eyes. "Then we're going to need a plan," she replied. The suburban war was about to enter its next phase, and David Chin was done being a passive participant. The local library's conference room became their war room. Spread across a long oak table were documents, digital files, and a growing collection of evidence that painted a damning picture of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Sarah Thompson, an investigative journalist with the Bay Area Chronicle, leaned forward, her eyes scanning the meticulously organized files David and Maria had compiled. She was known for taking down powerful local institutions, and this looked like her next big story. "This is more than just petty HOA overreach," Sarah muttered, spreading out a series of property records and HOA financial statements. "This looks systematic." David had spent weeks building their case. His software engineering background proved invaluable. He created a comprehensive database tracking every HOA fine, every violation, every interaction. Patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. The first major revelation was a potential conflict of interest. Judith Hargrove's husband, Robert Hargrove, was a real estate developer with suspicious connections to property transactions in the area. Multiple homeowners who had been forced out had their properties purchased by shell companies connected to Hargrove's development firm. Maria's legal expertise helped connect the dots. "It's a classic squeeze play," she explained. "Issue excessive fines, force foreclosures, then scoop up properties at below market rates." The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. 15 homeowners had been forced out in the past 3 years, all of whom didn't fit the HOA's narrow demographic profile. Young professionals, minorities, anyone with a slightly different vision of suburban living. David had also discovered something else, a series of irregularities in the HOA's financial reporting. Fines weren't being used for community maintenance as required by their bylaws. Instead, the money was being funneled through a complex network of accounts. "We need more than just suspicions," Sarah warned. "We need concrete proof." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mark Reynolds, a junior accountant who worked part-time for the HOA, reached out anonymously. He'd noticed discrepancies in the financial records and was uncomfortable with what he'd seen. A USB drive arrived in an unmarked envelope. Its contents were a goldmine: internal emails, financial spreadsheets, communication that revealed the depth of the HOA's corruption. Emails showed Judith Hargrove discussing potential property targets. Phrases like non-traditional homeowners and community cleansing appeared with disturbing frequency. Financial records showed kickback schemes, inflated maintenance contracts, and suspicious property transactions. The local news was their first target. Sarah Thompson's initial story sent shockwaves through the community. But David and Maria wanted more than just media attention. They wanted systemic change. They filed formal complaints with multiple agencies: the local county assessor's office, state real estate commission, fair housing authority, local legal aid organizations. Each complaint was backed by meticulous documentation. David had created a secure website collecting testimonies from affected homeowners, a digital repository of HOA abuses. Social media became their amplification tool. A hashtag Willow Creek Truth, began trending locally. Homeowners who had previously been too afraid to speak out now found their voice. "This isn't just about us anymore," Maria told David during a late-night strategy session. "This is about exposing a system that's been preying on homeowners for years." The HOA was beginning to panic. Judith Hargrove's carefully constructed facade was cracking. Anonymous sources within the organization were starting to leak information, seeking to distance themselves from the growing scandal. David looked at the wall of evidence, a mix of digital files and printed documents. What had started as a personal fight against a $250 fine had transformed into something much larger. The suburban rebellion had begun, and they were just getting started. The cracks in the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association appeared first as whispers, then as thunderous roars. Mark Reynolds, the junior accountant who had initially provided the anonymous USB drive, became a key witness. Nervous but determined, he agreed to a formal deposition, bringing with him a treasure trove of internal documents that exposed the HOA's financial machinations. It wasn't just about the fines, Mark testified during a preliminary hearing. It was a systematic approach to property acquisition. Every fine, every violation was carefully calculated to pressure specific homeowners out. The most damning evidence came from a series of email chains that revealed the true extent of Judith Hargrove's operations. Internal communications showed a coordinated effort to target homeowners who didn't fit the HOA's narrow definition of acceptable. Young professionals, minority families, anyone with a slightly unconventional approach to home ownership became marked targets. Board members began to turn on each other. Robert Hargrove, Judith's husband and the silent puppet master behind many of the schemes, found himself increasingly isolated. The development firm he used to acquire foreclosed properties was now under intense scrutiny. Lisa Martinez, a longtime board member, was the first to break ranks. During a heated emergency meeting, she confronted Judith directly. "We're not protecting a community," Lisa declared, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and shame. "We're destroying lives." The meeting descended into chaos. Years of suppressed tensions erupted as board members began to challenge the mechanisms they had silently supported for years. Financial records were scrutinized, past decisions questioned, and the carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Sarah Thompson's investigative pieces continued to drop like strategic bombs. Each article peeled back another layer of the HOA's corrupt practices. Social media amplified every revelation, with homeowners from Willow Creek Estates and beyond sharing their own stories of HOA harassment. The local government couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. The county assessor's office launched a full investigation. State-level housing authorities began reviewing the HOA's practices. What had started as David Chen's personal fight against a landscaping violation had transformed into a systemic review of HOA practices across the region. Robert Hargrove's real estate development firm found itself blacklisted. Banks began pulling back financing. Investors started distancing themselves. The economic consequences were swift and brutal. Judith's carefully cultivated network of influence began to disintegrate. The country club set that had once supported her now avoided her calls. Her annual neighborhood barbecue, once a prestigious event, was canceled as potential attendees withdrew. "They're treating us like we're criminals," Judith complained to her husband, the first signs of panic creeping into her voice. Robert's response was cold. "Not our problem anymore. Protect yourself." The HOA's legal team, once a formidable force that had intimidated countless homeowners, now found themselves on the defensive. Each legal maneuver was met with counter moves from David, Maria, and their growing network of supporters. Emergency meetings became war rooms of desperation. Board members who had once sat silently now spoke up, each revelation more damaging than the last. The HOA's financial records showed a labyrinth of questionable transactions, kickbacks, inflated maintenance contracts, strategic property acquisitions. Mark Reynolds became a hero to the homeowners. His courage in stepping forward had blown the entire operation wide open. Other internal sources began to come forward, emboldened by his example. David watched the unfolding drama with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. What had begun as a personal battle against a $250 fine had become a full-scale investigation that threatened to dismantle an entire system of suburban oppression. "We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore," Maria told him during a late-night strategy session. "We're fighting for every homeowner who's ever been bullied by an HOA." The suburban rebellion had found its moment, and the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association was about to face its reckoning. The city council chambers buzzed with an electric tension. Every seat was filled, with dozens more people standing in the back, spilling into the hallway. This was more than a hearing. It was a public reckoning for the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. David Chen sat at the front table, Maria Rodriguez beside him, their documentation spread out like a battle map. Judith Hargrove and the remaining HOA board members occupied the opposing side, their once pristine appearance now showing signs of strain. Sarah Thompson sat in the press section, her notebook ready, camera positioned to capture every moment. The hearing began with a comprehensive presentation of evidence. Mark Reynolds, the whistleblower accountant, provided detailed financial records that painted a damning picture. Spreadsheets showed a systematic approach to targeting specific homeowners, with financial transactions that raised multiple red flags. "These aren't just administrative errors," Mark testified, his voice steady despite the pressure. "This was a calculated strategy to force out homeowners who didn't fit a very narrow definition of community standards." One by one, homeowners came forward. The Kim family shared how they were fined for maintaining a traditional Korean garden. Mr. Thompson described the multiple violations he received for his abstract art-inspired exterior paint. Each story added another layer to the mounting evidence of systemic discrimination. Judith Hargrove's defense crumbled under the weight of documentation. Her husband Robert sat behind her, no longer the confident real estate developer, but a man watching his empire collapse. The most devastating moment came when internal emails were projected onto the large screen. Phrases like undesirable homeowners and community cleansing appeared in stark black and white. Judith's own words became her prosecution. "These communications reveal a pattern of intentional discrimination," David explained, his technical precision cutting through the emotional testimony. "This isn't about maintaining community standards. This is about controlling who can and cannot live in our neighborhood." Maria Rodriguez provided the legal framework, breaking down how the HOA's actions violated multiple fair housing laws. Her decades of civil rights legal experience turned each piece of evidence into a precise legal argument. The city council members listened intently, their expressions shifting from skepticism to outrage. This was no longer just a local dispute. It had become a landmark case about property rights, community standards, and systemic discrimination. Robert Hargrove was called to testify. Under oath, his carefully constructed facade began to crack. The shell companies, the suspicious property acquisitions, the coordinated efforts to force out non-traditional homeowners, all came to light. "We were just maintaining property values," Robert muttered at one point, a statement that only seemed to dig this hole deeper. The turning point came unexpectedly. Lisa Martinez, the board member who had previously spoken out, provided additional testimony that completely undermined the HOA's defense. She detailed internal discussions, revealed hidden agendas, and exposed the true nature of their operations. As the hearing progressed, it became clear this was no longer just about Willow Creek Estates. Media outlets from across the state were covering the story. It had become a rallying cry against HOA overreach. Judith Hargrove, once the untouchable queen of suburban conformity, now sat pale and defeated. Her network of influence had evaporated. The country club set that had once supported her now avoided her gaze. The city council's preliminary recommendation was clear: dissolve the current HOA board, launch a full investigation, return illegally collected fines, implement new fair housing guidelines. David caught Maria's eye. What had started with a simple landscaping violation had become something much larger: a fight for community, for fairness, for the right to exist without constant persecution. As the hearing concluded, the chambers erupted in applause. The suburban rebellion had won its most significant victory. 6 months after the historic city council hearing, Willow Creek Estates was unrecognizable. The old HOA board had been completely dismantled. Judith and Robert Hargrove faced multiple legal investigations, civil rights violations, financial fraud, and a host of other charges that threatened to financially ruin them. Their once powerful real estate development firm was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. David Chin stood in front of the newly renovated community center, preparing for the first truly democratic HOA election in the neighborhood's history. Beside him, Maria Rodriguez reviewed the newly drafted community guidelines, a document that celebrated diversity, protected homeowner rights, and eliminated the bureaucratic nightmares of the past. The transformation wasn't just administrative. The neighborhood itself had changed. Houses that were once identical now showcased individual creativity. The Kim's traditional Korean garden stood proudly next to Mr. Thompson's vibrant, art-inspired exterior. Native plant gardens replaced sterile, water-intensive lawns. Solar panels and modern architectural elements became points of pride, not punishment. Mark Reynolds, the whistleblower accountant, had become a local hero. His testimony had been crucial in exposing the HOA's corrupt practices. He now worked with a nonprofit that provided legal support to homeowners fighting unreasonable HOA restrictions across the state. The financial impact was significant. The HOA was required to return millions in illegally collected fines. Homeowners who had been forced out received compensation. The entire system of suburban governance was being re-examined. This isn't just about one neighborhood, Maria told a group of journalists during a follow-up story. This is about challenging the entire concept of how community standards are defined and enforced. David's original landscaping rocks, the ones that had started the entire conflict, now sat proudly in a memorial garden. A small plaque read, "Sometimes resistance begins with the smallest of things." The state legislature had taken notice. New laws were being drafted to provide more oversight for homeowners associations, inspired directly by the Willow Creek Estates case. What had begun as a personal fight had become a catalyst for broader change. During the first open HOA meeting under the new leadership, David found himself elected as the board president. Maria became the legal advisor. Their first act was to tear up the old, oppressive bylaws and create a new document that emphasized community, understanding, and individual expression. Judith Hargrove's final act of defiance came in the form of a desperate lawsuit, a move that backfired spectacularly. Not only was the case thrown out, but it resulted in additional legal scrutiny and potential criminal charges. The most satisfying moment came unexpectedly. Robert Hargrove's development firm was forced to sell several properties at a significant loss. The very homes they had tried to acquire through manipulation were now owned by the very people they had attempted to push out. Sarah Thompson's investigative series won multiple journalism awards. The story of Willow Creek Estates became a national conversation about property rights, community standards, and the dangers of unchecked power. During the first community barbecue under the new HOA, David looked around at the transformed neighborhood. Families of different backgrounds, ages, and lifestyles mingled freely. Children played. Neighbors talked. The rigid walls of conformity had been replaced by genuine community. "We did it," Maria said, joining him. "We actually did it." David thought back to that first violation notice, 2.5 inches of landscaping rocks that had started an entire revolution. Sometimes, change begins with the smallest of resistances. The suburban rebellion was complete, and Willow Creek Estates would never be the same again.